In the winter of 1880, on a cold October morning in Cologne, Germany, Emperor Wilhelm I stood before the tallest structure humanity had ever built. The twin spires of Cologne Cathedral pierced the sky at 515 feet, higher than any building in the world. But what made this moment truly extraordinary wasn't just the height, it was the time. 632 years. That's how long it took to build this cathedral. 6 centuries of construction. 25 generations of workers who never saw it finished. Winters that froze construction for months at a time. A massive wooden crane that stood motionless on an unfinished tower for 400 years, becoming Cologne's skyline. And all of this impossible architectural achievement began because of a Christmas story. Because in the year 1164, an archbishop brought home what he claimed were the bones of the 3 wise men who visited the infant Jesus. And those relics needed a worthy home. This is the story of how medieval engineers spent longer building a single cathedral than the United States has existed as a nation. How they overcame winters that could destroy a year's work in a single frost. How they lifted stones weighing tons without modern machinery. How they created flying buttresses and pointed arches that defied every engineering principle they understood. How they passed knowledge from master builder to apprentice across 25 generations. And how they never, not once in 632 years, abandoned the original vision. This is the story of Cologne Cathedral, and it's one of the most incredible achievements in human history. Before we understand how they built it, we need to understand why anyone would attempt something this impossible. The year is 1164. Cologne is already one of the most important cities in the Holy Roman Empire. It sits on the Rhine River, a major trade route connecting northern and southern Europe. The city is wealthy, powerful, and ambitious, but it's about to receive a gift that will change everything. Archbishop Reinald von Dassel returns from Italy with an extraordinary treasure. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa has just conquered Milan, and as spoils of war, Reinald has brought back a golden reliquary containing what are believed to be the bones of the 3 wise men. The Magi, the kings who followed the star to Bethlehem to worship the infant Christ. You have to understand what this meant in medieval Europe. These weren't just important relics, they were among the most significant objects in all of Christendom. The 3 wise men, or Magi, appear in the Gospel of Matthew. They followed a star from the east to find the infant Christ. They brought 3 gifts: gold, symbolizing kingship; frankincense, symbolizing divinity; myrrh, symbolizing mortality and sacrifice. These mysterious visitors represented something profound. The recognition of Christ by the Gentile world, by people outside the Jewish tradition. They connected the nativity story to royal authority and ancient wisdom. They symbolized the meeting of East and West, of pagan knowledge and new Christian faith. The story of how these relics came to Cologne is itself remarkable. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had just sacked Milan in 1162. Among the spoils were bones that the Milanese claimed belonged to the 3 kings. Whether these were authentic relics of the Magi, bones of other holy figures, or simply medieval forgeries, we'll never know with certainty. What matters is that medieval people believed they were authentic, and Archbishop Reinald von Dassel, Frederick's chancellor, saw an opportunity. He requested the relics as his portion of the spoils and brought them back to Cologne in triumph. The journey itself became legendary. The bones were carried in a golden chest, accompanied by elaborate ceremony, through cities that turned out to watch their passage. When they arrived in Cologne on July 23rd, 1164, the city erupted in celebration. Within months, pilgrims began arriving. They came from across Europe, from Scandinavia to Spain, from Ireland to Poland, from Scotland to Hungary. They came seeking blessings, miracles, absolution. Medieval people believed that relics held power, that proximity to holy remains could heal illness, forgive sins, grant favours. The more important the saint, the more powerful the relic. And what could be more important than the bones of the three kings who had worshipped Christ himself? The economic impact was immediate. Pilgrims brought money, tribute, offerings. They needed food, lodging, supplies. They purchased badges, tokens, souvenirs. The pilgrimage trade transformed Cologne's economy. The city grew wealthier, more important, more connected to the broader European world. But Cologne's modest cathedral, a Carolingian structure built around 870, simply couldn't handle the crowds. On feast days, pilgrims packed the nave, overflowed into the streets, created chaos. The building was too small, too dark, too plain. More importantly, it wasn't worthy of such precious relics. The three kings deserved a temple befitting their significance, a structure that would announce to all of Europe that Cologne possessed treasures beyond price, a building so magnificent that it would itself become a destination, drawing pilgrims not just to see the relics, but to marvel at the cathedral that housed them. The city leaders and church officials faced a decision. They could expand the old cathedral, patch it, make do with what they had, or they could build something unprecedented, something that would announce to all of Europe that Cologne possessed treasures beyond price, something that would stand as a monument to human capability and divine glory, something that had never been attempted before on this scale. They chose the impossible. They would build the largest Gothic cathedral in northern Europe, higher than anything in Germany, more elaborate than the great French cathedrals, a structure so ambitious it would take generations to complete. And they would do it using engineering techniques that were still being invented. On August 15th, 1248, Archbishop Conrad von Hochstaden laid the foundation stone. It was the feast of the Assumption of Mary, a holy day, an auspicious beginning. Master Gerhard, the first master builder, had designed something extraordinary. The cathedral would be 473 feet long, 143 feet wide at the nave, with twin towers reaching toward heaven at heights that seemed impossible. The design was based on the French Gothic style, particularly Amiens Cathedral, but it would exceed every French example. It would be higher, wider, more elaborate, more ambitious than anything yet attempted in the Gothic style. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. Master Gerhard and everyone involved in that foundation ceremony in 1248 knew something that we often forget. They knew they would never see it finished. Medieval cathedral construction proceeded at roughly 8 to 20 inches per day, when work could happen at all. The mathematics was inescapable. This cathedral would take at minimum a century to complete, probably 2 centuries, possibly longer. Master Gerhard himself would be lucky to see the choir completed. The workers laying the foundation stones that day would not live to see the roof. Their children wouldn't see the nave finished. Their grandchildren wouldn't see the towers begun. And yet they started anyway. The first challenge was the foundation itself. The site had been occupied by Christian structures since the 4th century. Beneath the ground lay the remains of a Roman temple, an early Christian church, the Carolingian Cathedral. All of this had to be carefully excavated or built around. The foundations needed to support unimaginable weight. The completed cathedral would weigh hundreds of thousands of tons. Those loads had to be transmitted through soil that included Roman ruins, medieval graves, and underground water channels. Master Gerhard's solution was brilliant. Where possible, they built on top of existing foundations. Where new foundations were needed, they used massive blocks of basalt, a volcanic rock, connected with tough stone and mortar. These foundations went deep, sometimes 20 feet or more, reaching down to stable soil or bedrock, and they built them wide, spreading the weight across as large an area as possible. The excavation alone took years, and here's where the first seasonal challenge appeared. Medieval construction could only happen during specific months, from roughly April through October, weather permitting. The reason was the mortar, that humble mixture of quicklime, sand and water that held the stones together. Understanding medieval mortar is essential to understanding why construction had to stop. Every winter, lime mortar isn't like modern Portland cement. It doesn't harden through chemical reaction alone. It cures through a process called carbonation. The water in the mortar evaporates, and carbon dioxide from the air reacts with the calcium hydroxide in the lime to form calcium carbonate. That's what makes the mortar hard. But this process requires specific conditions: temperature above freezing, air circulation, time, lots of time. Medieval lime mortar could take weeks or even months to fully cure, depending on the weather and the thickness of the mortar joint. And here's the critical vulnerability. If the temperature drops below freezing before the mortar has cured, the water in the mixture freezes. When water freezes, it expands. That expansion creates pressure within the mortar joint, forcing the stones apart slightly. When it thaws, the damage is done. The bond is weakened or destroyed entirely. The stone shifts, cracks appear, and worst of all, you often don't see the damage immediately. It might take months for the weakened mortar to fail catastrophically. Medieval builders learned this through bitter experience. We have records of walls collapsing after winter, vaults cracking, arches failing. Not because the design was wrong or the construction was sloppy, but because a late-season cold snap froze mortar that hadn't fully cured. So they developed strict seasonal protocols. Construction started in spring when the soil was thawed and days were reliably above freezing. It continued through summer when warm weather ensured rapid curing, and it stopped in autumn, usually by October, giving the last mortar laid enough time to cure before winter frost arrived. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a fundamental constraint that shaped everything about medieval construction. You couldn't build as fast as your workforce allowed. You could only build as fast as the seasons permitted. If you laid too much stone in September, hoping to get one more course completed before winter, you risked having that work destroyed by November frost. Better to stop early, protect what you'd built, and start fresh in spring. Every autumn, as the days grew shorter and colder, construction had to stop. The masons would carefully cover all exposed surfaces with layers of protection. First, straw, packed tightly into joints, and spread over horizontal surfaces. Then, manure, which seems strange to modern sensibilities but made perfect sense to medieval builders. Manure generates heat as it decomposes. That heat, combined with the insulation provided by the straw, could keep mortar just warm enough to prevent freezing, even in moderately cold weather. Over all of this, they would place heavy cloth or leather sheets, weighted down with stones to prevent them from blowing away in winter storms. The entire site would be winterized, made as resistant to cold and moisture as possible. But it was never perfect. Hard winters still caused damage. Spring often meant repairing walls that had cracked, replacing stones that had shifted, repointing mortar joints that had failed. The stone cutters would retreat to their heated workshops to prepare blocks for the next building season. The masons would go home, or travel to other sites where work might continue. The labourers would find other work, and the site would sit silent through winter, waiting for spring. This pattern would continue for 632 years. 632 winters where work stopped. 632 springs where it began again. Master Gerhard died around 1270. He had worked on the cathedral for perhaps 20 years, overseeing the foundation and the beginning of the choir, the eastern end where the altar would stand. Master Arnold took over, continuing work on the choir. Then Master Johannes. Each master builder inherited the plans, the workforce, the challenges from his predecessor. Each made his own contributions, his own innovations, his own mistakes and triumphs. This is one of the most extraordinary aspects of medieval cathedral construction: the continuity of vision across generations. By 1322, the choir was complete. 74 years of construction, 3/4 of a century for one section of the building. But what a section! The choir of Cologne Cathedral is a masterpiece of Gothic engineering. Soaring pointed arches that distribute weight more efficiently than rounded Romanesque arches. Ribbed vaults that channel forces along specific lines rather than across entire surfaces. Flying buttresses that take the lateral thrust of the vaulting and transmit it outward and downward to massive external supports. And windows. Enormous windows filled with stained glass that transform the interior into a kaleidoscope of coloured light. The choir was consecrated in 1322, sealed off with a temporary wall and put into use for services while construction continued. The congregation could worship in the finished section while work proceeded on the nave. This was common in medieval cathedral construction. Build section by section. Use what's finished while you build what's next. But here's what's remarkable about that choir. Even in 1322, just the finished choir was larger than most cathedrals. The height from floor to vault was over 140 feet. The windows covered thousands of square feet. The sheer volume of space was unprecedented, and it was all held up by stone. No steel reinforcement, no concrete, just precisely cut blocks of limestone and sandstone, held together with lime mortar, arranged in shapes that defied intuition but satisfied the laws of physics. How did they do this? How did medieval engineers, with no mathematical theory of structures, no computer modelling, no stress analysis, create buildings that still stand today? The answer is both simple and profound. Geometry and experience. Medieval master builders understood building through shapes and proportions. They knew that a pointed arch could span a wider distance than a round arch of the same height. They knew that ribs concentrated forces along specific paths. They knew that buttresses needed to be placed at precise intervals to counteract lateral thrust. They knew these things not because they could calculate them mathematically, but because they could see them geometrically and test them empirically. Master builders kept detailed sketchbooks. We have examples that survived, like the notebooks of Villars de Honnecourt from the 13th century. These books contain drawings of machines, geometric constructions, architectural details, and construction techniques. They show how medieval engineers thought, not in terms of force vectors and stress calculations, but in terms of proportions and relationships. If an arch is too wide for its height, it will fail. If a buttress is too far from the wall it supports, it won't counteract the thrust effectively. If the mortar ratio is wrong, it won't bind properly. These were lessons learned through observation, experiment, success, and catastrophic failure. Every collapsed vault, every buckled wall, every cracked arch taught the next generation something valuable. And here's the critical part. This knowledge was passed down through an apprenticeship system that lasted years, sometimes decades. A boy might start as an apprentice at age 12 or 13. He would spend 7 years learning to cut stone, understanding different types of rock, mastering the tools of the trade. He would learn about the mysterious properties of limestone and sandstone, how some stones split easily along natural plains, while others could be carved in any direction. He would learn about mortar mixing, the precise ratio of lime to sand to water that would produce a strong bond. He would learn about the seasons, when work could proceed and when it had to stop. After 7 years as an apprentice, he might become a journeyman, travelling from site to site, working on different projects, learning different techniques from different masters. And if he proved exceptionally skilled, if he demonstrated both technical mastery and creative vision, he might eventually become a master mason himself. This is how knowledge travelled across 6 centuries, from Master Gerhard in 1248 to the final master builder in 1880, person to person, hand to hand, mind to mind, each generation adding its understanding to what came before. After the choir was completed in 1322, work began on the nave, the long central section where the congregation would gather. Master Johannes was in charge, working from Master Gerhard's original plans. The nave would be even more ambitious than the choir. Longer, wider, with even larger windows. But construction was slower now. The initial enthusiasm had faded somewhat. The relics of the three wise men were safely housed in a magnificent golden shrine in the completed choir. The urgency was less intense. Still work continued. Stone cutters shaped blocks in the quarry at Drachenfels, 7 miles south along the Rhine. The mountain itself was being carved away to build the cathedral, its grey trachyte stone, perfect for the massive undertaking. Barges loaded with cut stone floated down the Rhine to Cologne. Cranes lifted the blocks from the boats. Oxen hauled them to the construction site. Master masons fitted them into place, with tolerances of less than a quarter inch. The mortar between stones was often thinner than a knife blade. This precision was essential. If the stones didn't fit exactly, the loads wouldn't distribute evenly. Uneven load distribution meant stress concentrations. Stress concentrations meant cracks. Cracks meant failure. By the mid-1400s, the nave was progressing, but challenges were mounting. The Black Death had swept through Europe, killing perhaps a third of the population. Labour was scarce, costs were rising, and something else was changing. Architectural fashion was shifting. The Gothic style, so innovative in 1248, was becoming commonplace by 1450. What had been cutting-edge engineering was now standard practice. The excitement, the sense of pioneering something unprecedented, was fading. In 1473, construction slowed dramatically. Then around 1560 it stopped entirely. Not because anyone decided to abandon the project, not because of a single catastrophic event, but because resources dried up, interest waned, other priorities emerged. The Reformation was fracturing Christianity, wars were consuming funds. The Renaissance was bringing new architectural styles that made Gothic seem old-fashioned. When work stopped in 1560, the cathedral was roughly 70 to 80% complete. The choir was finished. The nave was mostly built, but the western facade, the twin towers that were meant to be the cathedral's crowning glory, were incomplete. The south tower was built up to the belfry level, maybe 180 feet high. The north tower was barely started, and on top of the south tower, a massive wooden crane remained in place. A treadwheel. Crane perhaps 25 meters tall, built in the 1400s to lift stones to ever greater heights. Workers would walk inside a large wheel, like a hamster wheel, their weight turning the wheel, which turned a drum, which wound a rope, which lifted loads of up to 2 tons. That crane would stand there for the next 300 years. It became as much a part of Cologne's skyline as the cathedral itself, an enormous wooden structure perched on top of an incomplete Gothic tower, visible from miles away, a reminder of unfinished ambition. Children grew up seeing that crane. They had children who saw that crane. Those children had children who saw that crane. Generation after generation, the crane stood motionless, weathering storms, resisting, decay, waiting for work that never came. There was even a local saying that developed during this period: when the cathedral is finally completed, the world will end. It was half joke, half resignation. The cathedral seemed destined to remain forever unfinished, but 300 years is a long time. And during those 300 years, something interesting happened. The unfinished cathedral became a symbol. During the Napoleonic Wars, French troops occupied Cologne. They used the cathedral as a stable and hay barn. Horses were kept where pilgrims once prayed. The building fell into disrepair. Sculptures eroded, windows broke. The structure, already incomplete, began to deteriorate. But in the early 1800s, as Napoleon's empire collapsed and German nationalism began to rise, people started looking at the unfinished cathedral differently. Not as a relic of medieval superstition, but as a symbol of German achievement and potential. Artists and architects rediscovered medieval architecture with romantic enthusiasm. They saw Gothic cathedrals not as primitive attempts at building, but as sophisticated masterpieces of engineering and art. In 1814, scholars discovered something remarkable. The original 13th century architectural drawings for Cologne Cathedral, including the designs for the unfinished facade and towers, had survived. They were found in an old building in Darmstadt, complete, detailed plans showing exactly how the medieval master builders had intended the cathedral to look. This discovery changed everything. Now it was possible to complete the cathedral not according to 1800s aesthetics, but according to the 1300s vision, to finish what had been started 600 years earlier. But completing a Gothic cathedral in the 1800s presented unique challenges. The medieval knowledge of Gothic construction had largely been lost. The guilds were gone. The apprenticeship system had collapsed. The techniques for calculating proportions and distributing loads had been replaced by different architectural approaches. Engineers and architects had to become archaeological detectives. They studied the existing structure, measuring every dimension, analysing every detail, trying to understand the geometric principles the medieval builders had used. They examined the surviving drawings, reverse engineering the intended design. They experimented with scale models, testing how forces would distribute through the proposed towers. And they made a crucial decision. They would use modern construction techniques, including iron reinforcement and more sophisticated cranes, but they would faithfully reproduce the medieval design. The cathedral would be completed as it was originally planned, but with 1800s engineering supporting 1300s architecture. In 1842, King Frederick William IV of Prussia laid a new cornerstone, restarting construction after a 300-year pause. Two architects, Ernst Friedrich Zwirner and later Richard Feuchtel, took charge of the project. Funding came partly from the Prussian state, but mostly from public subscription. A group called the Central Dombauverein raised two-thirds of the enormous cost, over $1 billion in today's money, through donations from ordinary citizens. This was a national project now, not just a religious one. The cathedral became a symbol of German unity, cultural achievement, technical prowess. And the work proceeded at a pace that would have astonished the medieval builders. With modern cranes, iron girders for roof support, better organisation of labour, and most importantly, the freedom to work through winter using heated enclosures and chemical additives that allowed mortar to cure in cold weather. Construction that would have taken decades in the 1400s took years in the 1800s. The nave was completed, the roof was finished, and then came the towers. The western facade with its twin spires had been the most ambitious part of the original design. Each tower would rise 515 feet, making them the tallest structures in the world. Building to that height was challenging even with 1800s technology. The weight accumulated as the towers rose. Every stone added mass that had to be supported by everything below. The loads on the foundation increased exponentially. The risk of buckling increased with height, and there was the wind. At 500 feet, wind forces become significant. The towers had to resist not just their own weight, but lateral forces from storms that could exceed several tons. The solution was a combination of medieval wisdom and modern engineering. The basic structure followed the 1300s plans. Massive stone walls with pointed arches and flying buttresses, but hidden within the stonework were iron tie rods, connecting opposite walls, preventing them from bulging outward under load. The roof trusses were iron instead of wood, lighter and stronger. The foundations were reinforced with additional masonry, spreading the immense weight across an even larger area. Stone by stone, the towers rose. 400 feet, 450 feet, 500 feet. Higher than any cathedral in Europe, higher than any building in the world. The crane from the 1400s was finally dismantled. Modern steam-powered cranes took its place, lifting loads that would have required dozens of men walking in treadwheels. On August 14th, 1880, after 632 years, 4 months, and 28 days, Cologne Cathedral was complete. The final stone was set in the North Tower spire. The structure stood 515 feet tall. The twin towers were virtually identical in height, within a few centimetres of each other, despite being built centuries apart. The nave stretched 473 feet long. The interior volume was nearly 400,000 cubic metres. The windows covered more than 10,000 square metres of surface area. It was the largest Gothic cathedral in Northern Europe, and for 4 years until the Washington Monument was completed in 1884, it was the tallest building in the entire world. The celebration on October 15th, 1880, was attended by Emperor Wilhelm I and drew crowds from across Germany and Europe. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about that celebration was this. The cathedral that was finally complete looked almost exactly as Master Gerhard had designed it in 1248. The proportions, the details, the Gothic vocabulary of pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, all of it was faithful to the original vision. 632 years hadn't changed the design. 25 generations of builders had remained committed to completing what the first generation had started. Think about that for a moment. The United States has existed for less than 250 years. The cathedral took more than twice that long to build. When construction began, the Ming dynasty didn't exist. The Aztec Empire hadn't been founded. The printing press wouldn't be invented for another 200 years. Columbus wouldn't sail for another 244 years. The Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, all of these happened while the cathedral sat unfinished. Empires rose and fell. Technologies were invented and became obsolete. The entire structure of European society transformed multiple times, but the cathedral endured. The vision endured. The commitment to completion endured. Now let's talk about the engineering that made this possible, because the real marvel isn't just that they built it, it's how they built it. Gothic architecture is fundamentally about manipulating how forces travel through stone. A building is constantly trying to collapse under its own weight. Gravity pulls down on every stone, every vault, every spire. The engineer's job is to guide those forces safely to the ground. In Romanesque architecture, which came before Gothic, the solution was simple. Thick walls, massive walls that could resist any force through sheer bulk. But thick walls meant small windows. Small windows meant dark interiors, and dark interiors didn't align with the religious symbolism of divine light. Gothic engineers wanted the opposite. Thin walls, huge windows, interiors flooded with light. But thin walls can't support heavy vaults. So they had to completely reimagine how buildings work. The key innovation was the pointed arch. A rounded Romanesque arch exerts significant lateral thrust. It pushes outward as well as downward. The walls have to be thick enough to resist that outward push. But a pointed arch, especially a tall, narrow one, exerts mostly downward force. The lateral thrust is much smaller. This means the walls don't have to resist as much sideways push. They can be thinner, but you can't eliminate lateral thrust entirely. So Gothic engineers used flying buttresses. These are separate structures, arches that spring from external piers and press against the upper walls, right where the vault's thrust is concentrated. The thrust from the vault goes into the flying buttress, which transmits it down to a massive external pier, which transmits it to the ground. The wall itself is almost freed from having to resist the vault's lateral forces. It becomes primarily a vertical support, not a lateral one. And that means it can be thin. It can be mostly window. The ribbed vault works similarly. Instead of a heavy barrel vault where the entire curved surface bears load, a ribbed vault concentrates the forces along specific ribs. Those ribs channel the weight to specific points on the walls, which are then supported by piers and buttresses. Between the ribs, the vault surface is relatively thin stone or brick, covering the space but not carrying heavy loads. This system is brilliant, but it's also precarious. Everything has to work together. The arches must be the right shape. The buttresses must be positioned precisely where the thrust is concentrated. The ribs must align with the supporting piers. If any element is wrong, if any measurement is off, the system fails, and there's no margin for error. Unlike a thick Romanesque wall, which can survive having a stone out of place, or a crack in the mortar, Gothic structures are finely balanced. They work because every piece is exactly where it needs to be, doing exactly what it needs to do. The master builders who designed Cologne Cathedral understood this intuitively. They couldn't calculate the forces mathematically, but they could see the geometry. They could draw the shapes, build the forms, observe how forces flowed through the structure, and they could test. When a design worked, they used it again. When it failed, they learned from the failure and tried something different. This empirical approach to engineering, based on observation and experience rather than theory and calculation, produced structures that still stand today. Structures that modern engineers study with sophisticated computer models, confirming that yes, the forces do distribute the way the Gothic masters intended. Yes, the structure is in equilibrium. Yes, it works. But here's what's truly remarkable. The medieval builders achieved this without seeing the complete structure for centuries. Master Gerhard designed the cathedral in 1248, but he died around 1270 without seeing the choir completed. Master Arnold continued the work, but he never saw the nave. Master Johannes worked on the nave, but never saw the towers begun. Each generation built a piece, trusting that their piece would integrate with what came before and what would come after. That trust was based on the drawings, on the proportions, on the geometric relationships encoded in the design. As long as everyone followed the same proportional system, used the same geometric principles, the pieces would fit together. And they did. When the 1800s builders finally completed the towers, they fit perfectly with the 1300s choir and the 1400s nave. Everything aligned, everything worked. 6 centuries of construction had produced a unified, coherent structure. Consider the practical challenges this presented. The stone for the cathedral came from quarries miles away, different quarries at different times. Drachenfels trachyte for the main structure, sandstone from other sources for decorative elements. Each type of stone has different properties, different hardness, different weight, different response to weathering. The builders had to select the right stone for each application, understanding which types could bear heavy loads, which were suitable for intricate carving, which would weather well in exposed locations. The transportation was itself an engineering challenge. A single large stone might weigh several tons. Moving it from the quarry to the building site required planning, equipment, and coordination. If possible, stones were transported by water. Barges on the Rhine could carry enormous loads that would have been impossible to move overland. But from the riverbank to the building site, oxen were used. Sometimes a single stone required 20 teams of oxen, 40 animals pulling together. And then there were the tools. Medieval stonecutters worked with hammer and chisel. That's it. No power tools, no diamond saws, just steel chisels, iron hammers, and immense skill. A skilled mason could shape a stone block with tolerances of less than a quarter inch. He could carve intricate decorative elements, figures, foliage, architectural details, all by hand. The tools themselves were precious. A master mason's chisels were his most valuable possessions, carefully maintained, sharpened regularly, protected from damage. The workshops where stone cutting happened year-round were heated spaces where craftsmen could work even when the construction site was frozen. Here they prepared blocks during winter, stockpiling them for spring, when the masons could lay them. This was one way to partially overcome the seasonal limitation. Stone cutting wasn't dependent on mortar curing, so it could continue through cold weather. The masons would arrive in spring to find hundreds or thousands of blocks ready to install. The cranes used to lift stone are engineering marvels themselves. The treadwheel crane that stood on the South Tower for 400 years was a massive wooden structure. The wheel was perhaps 10 to 15 feet in diameter. Several men would walk inside, their weight turning the wheel, which turned a vertical shaft, which wound a rope around a drum. The mechanical advantage meant that a few men walking could lift loads of a ton or more. These cranes could be repositioned as the building rose, always working at the level where stones needed to be placed, but they were also dangerous. If the load was too heavy, if the rope broke, if the wheel mechanism failed, men could be injured or killed, and yet they were essential. Without them, Gothic architecture would have been impossible. You can't build 500-foot towers by passing stones from hand to hand. The scaffolding was another challenge. Medieval scaffolding was typically wooden, built from the ground up as the walls rose, but at a certain height, ground-based scaffolding becomes impractical. Too much wood is required. The structure becomes unstable, so for the upper levels, scaffolding was often hung from the structure itself. Holes were left in the masonry, and wooden beams were inserted, creating platforms from which masons could work. When that section was complete, the beams were removed, the holes were filled, and the scaffolding moved higher. You can still see some of these holes in medieval structures, though many have been filled in during later restorations. The working conditions were brutal. Masons and labourers worked from dawn to dusk during construction season. The work was physically demanding, moving heavy stones, climbing scaffolding, working at heights in all weather. Falls were common, injuries were expected. Death was not unusual, and the pay, while better than agricultural labour, was still modest. A skilled mason might earn enough to support his family comfortably, but he wouldn't become wealthy. Yet men did this work for generations. Why? Partly because it was employment. Cathedral construction meant decades or centuries of steady work, rare in medieval Europe. Partly because there was pride in the craft. A mason who worked on a cathedral was building something permanent, something that would outlast him by centuries. His work would be seen by thousands, remembered long after he was gone, and partly because there was genuine religious devotion. Many workers believed they were building a house for God, and that belief made the hardship meaningful. The winter shutdowns weren't just inconveniences, they were fundamental limitations on what could be accomplished. Every autumn, work had to stop at whatever point it had reached. If you were in the middle of building a vault, too bad. The vault would have to wait until spring. The unfinished work had to be carefully protected. Exposed mortar was covered with straw and manure, which provided insulation and prevented freezing. Sculptures were wrapped in cloth. Windows were boarded up. The entire site was winterized. And then everyone waited. Stone cutters continued in their workshops. Masons went home or travelled to other sites. Labourers found other work. The master builder used the winter to plan the next season's work, to prepare drawings, to calculate what materials would be needed, to organise the logistics of resuming construction. This cycle repeated every year for 632 years. 632 winters where the unfinished cathedral sat silent, waiting for spring. It's hard to convey just how remarkable this is. The patience required, the faith that eventually, someday, it would be finished. The commitment to continue, even when completion seemed impossibly distant. When work stopped in 1560, the cathedral had been under construction for 312 years. No one alive had known a time when the cathedral wasn't being built. It was a permanent feature of the city, an ongoing project, something that had always been there and always would be. And then it stopped. For 300 years, 3 centuries where the incomplete cathedral just stood there, with that enormous wooden crane on top of the South Tower, reminding everyone of abandoned ambition. But those 300 years didn't erase the work that had been done. The choir stood. The nave stood. The foundations were solid. The structure, though incomplete, was sound. And when construction finally resumed in 1842, The 18th century builders found that the 13th century work was still perfectly good. The stones hadn't shifted, the mortar had set hard as rock, the buttresses were still doing their job. The medieval engineers had built so well that their work survived 300 years of neglect without significant deterioration. That's the ultimate test of construction quality. Not whether it works when it's new, but whether it endures when it's abandoned. The completion of Cologne Cathedral in 1880 marked the end of the longest construction project in modern history. But it also marked something else, the vindication of Gothic engineering. In 1880, engineers could calculate stresses, model forces, predict behaviour with mathematics, and when they analysed the completed cathedral, they found that the medieval design worked perfectly. The forces distributed exactly as they needed to. The structure was in stable equilibrium. The Gothic masters, working with geometry and experience rather than mathematics, had created something that satisfied the laws of physics precisely. Modern engineers weren't improving on the medieval design. They were confirming its brilliance. Today, Cologne Cathedral is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It receives about 6 million visitors per year, making it Germany's most visited landmark. The twin spires remain instantly recognisable, dominating Cologne's skyline just as they were meant to. The interior still takes your breath away, with its soaring vaults, its forests of columns, its windows that flood the space with coloured light. The Shrine of the Three Kings, the golden reliquary that started this whole project in 1164, still sits in the choir, visited by pilgrims and tourists alike. And here's something remarkable. The cathedral is still under construction. Not major construction, but perpetual maintenance and restoration. There's a permanent workshop, the Dombauhütte, staffed by stonemasons, sculptors, and craftsmen who repair damage from weather, pollution, and age. They replace eroded stones, restore sculptures, clean surfaces. This work is ongoing and will continue indefinitely. In a sense, the cathedral will never be completely finished. It will always need care, always need attention, always need skilled hands to preserve it for the next generation. The impact of Cologne Cathedral on architecture and engineering is difficult to overstate. It proved that Gothic construction could achieve unprecedented scales. It demonstrated that knowledge could be preserved and transmitted across centuries. It showed that vision and commitment could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and it inspired countless other projects. When architects around the world wanted to build soaring, light-filled spaces, they looked to Gothic principles pioneered in cathedrals like Cologne. The techniques developed for cathedral construction influenced castle design, palace design, civic architecture. The engineering principles of load distribution, structural equilibrium, and geometric proportion became foundational to architecture. But beyond the technical achievements, Cologne Cathedral represents something profound about human nature. The willingness to start something you know you won't finish. The faith that future generations will continue what you began. The commitment to a vision that transcends individual lifetimes. Every person who worked on the cathedral from 1248 to 1880 knew they were part of something larger than themselves. They were contributing to a project that began before they were born and would continue after they died. That kind of long-term thinking, that kind of generational commitment seems almost impossible in our current world where we expect instant results and immediate gratification. Think about what this means. Master Gerhard laid out the design in 1248. He established proportions, dimensions, geometric relationships. He created a vision. And in 1880, when Ernst Friedrich Zwirner set the final stone in the North Tower spire, that vision was realised exactly as Master Gerhard had planned it. 6 centuries hadn't changed the fundamental design. Different builders, different tools, different knowledge, but the same vision. That's the power of geometric proportion and architectural planning. That's the power of committing to excellence and precision. That's the power of trusting future generations to honour what you started. The story of Cologne Cathedral is ultimately a Christmas story. Not because of the religious symbolism, though that's certainly part of it, but because it began with the relics of the three wise men, those legendary figures who brought gifts to the Christ child. The cathedral was built to honour that story, to provide a worthy home for those relics, to celebrate the connection between the ancient world and Christian faith. Every year on Christmas Eve, midnight mass is held in the cathedral. The interior is lit by thousands of candles. The choir, completed in 1322, fills with music. The shrine of the three kings gleams in the candlelight. And for a few hours, the cathedral becomes what it was always meant to be. Not a tourist attraction, not an architectural marvel, but a sacred space, connecting the present moment to an ancient story, connecting this generation to all the generations who built and maintained this extraordinary structure. The engineering challenges of Cologne Cathedral remind us that the past wasn't primitive. Medieval builders didn't have our tools, but they had deep knowledge, incredible skill, and sophisticated understanding of how materials and forces work. They built structures that still function perfectly 700 years later. They solved problems that would challenge modern engineers. They created beauty and functionality without computers, without calculators, without steel, without modern materials. They had stone, mortar, geometry, and genius, and that was enough. The seasonal limitations remind us that great achievements take time. You can't rush cathedral construction. You can't force stone to cure faster. You can't ignore winter. You have to work within natural constraints, adapt to seasonal rhythms, accept that some things simply cannot be hurried. This patience, this acceptance of natural limits, produced structures that have endured for centuries. Modern buildings, constructed quickly with modern materials, often don't last a century. Medieval cathedrals, built slowly with traditional materials and methods, have lasted 10 times as long. The generational commitment reminds us that some things are worth doing even if we won't see them completed. Master Gerhard knew he'd never see the finished cathedral. He built anyway. Every mason who laid stones in the foundation knew those stones would be buried, invisible, forgotten. They laid them with precision anyway. Every carpenter who built scaffolding knew it would be torn down and discarded. They built it strong anyway. Because the work mattered. The vision mattered. The contribution mattered. Even if you don't see the result, even if you don't get credit, even if your individual effort seems small in the context of a 6th century project, it matters. The technical sophistication reminds us that engineering is both art and science. The Gothic masters didn't have structural theory, but they understood forces intuitively. They saw relationships geometrically that we now express mathematically. They tested empirically what we now model computationally. Different methods, same results. Their buildings stand because they understood the fundamentals. Weight must be supported, forces must be balanced, loads must be distributed. Materials have limits. These principles don't change. The mathematics that describes them is useful, but you can build without mathematics if you understand the physical reality beneath the equations. The unfinished period reminds us that pausing doesn't mean failing. For 300 years, the cathedral sat incomplete. The project wasn't abandoned, it wasn't destroyed, it just waited. And when conditions were right, when resources were available, when commitment was renewed, construction resumed. The wait didn't invalidate what had been done. It just meant the timeline was longer than expected. How many of our own projects, our own dreams, our own ambitions sit incomplete, not failed, not abandoned, just waiting for the right time to continue? The modern completion reminds us that old wisdom can combine with new techniques. The 1800s builders didn't try to redesign the cathedral in their contemporary style. They respected the original vision. using modern methods to achieve medieval designs. They recognized that Master Gerhard's plans were excellent, that Gothic engineering was sophisticated, that the 13th century design didn't need improvement. They just needed to finish what had been started. That combination of respect for tradition and willingness to use new tools is rare and valuable. Cologne Cathedral stands today as a testament to human capability, determination, and cooperation across time. It's a wonder of medieval engineering, completed with modern assistance. It's a religious building that has survived religious conflicts. It's a symbol of German culture that has endured wars, revolutions, and reunifications. It's a source of civic pride that draws millions of visitors from around the world. And it all began because an archbishop brought home some bones he believed were holy. Because people wanted to build something worthy of those relics. Because craftsmen dedicated their lives to a project they'd never see finished. Because generation after generation refused to abandon the vision, refused to settle for something easier, refused to let time and difficulty defeat them. When you stand in front of Cologne Cathedral today, look up at those twin spires reaching 515 feet into the sky. Remember that every stone was cut by hand, every piece was lifted by human power, or later, by steam power that humans operated. Every detail was planned, measured, cut, placed with precision that modern instruments confirm but cannot improve. Remember that this took 632 years, 25 generations, hundreds of thousands of workers, millions of stones. Countless challenges, setbacks, problems solved, disasters averted. Remember that it survived 300 years incomplete, with a wooden crane on top as a reminder of unfinished business. And remember that when it was finally complete, when Emperor Wilhelm I stood before the tallest building in the world in 1880, it looked exactly as Master Gerhard had planned it in 1248. That's not just engineering achievement. That's human achievement. That's what we can do when we commit to excellence, accept the limitations reality imposes, trust future generations to continue what we start, and refuse to compromise on vision. The cathedral that took 632 years to build stands today as proof that the impossible is possible. If you're patient enough, if you're skilled enough, if you're committed enough, if you're willing to be part of something larger than yourself. The 3 wise men brought gifts to a child in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, according to tradition. Those gifts represented wisdom, worship, and recognition. The cathedral built to honor their memory represents something similar. The wisdom of generations of engineers and craftsmen. The worship of beauty, excellence, and the divine. The recognition that humans can achieve extraordinary things when they work together across time. That's the real miracle of Cologne Cathedral. Not that it's tall, not that it's beautiful, but that it exists at all. 632 years, 25 generations, one vision, one cathedral, still standing, still inspiring, still demonstrating what humans can accomplish when they dream big enough to imagine something that will outlast them. When you see Cologne Cathedral, you're not just seeing stone and glass and mortar, you're seeing the accumulated effort of thousands of lives devoted to creating something permanent. You're seeing proof that patience and skill can overcome any obstacle. You're seeing evidence that medieval engineers understood forces and structures as well as we do. They just express that understanding differently. And you're seeing the power of never giving up, even when the goal seems impossibly distant, even when you'll be dead before it's achieved, even when 300 years pass with no progress at all. Because eventually, if the vision is good and the work is sound, someone will come along and finish what you started. That's the legacy of Cologne Cathedral. That's the gift the medieval builders gave us. Not just a building, but proof that impossible things become possible if you refuse to accept defeat.